With its long, illustrious history in radio news, it was only natural that the BBC would become a leader in television news as well. Radio remained strong in the UK even after television had started. With no daytime programming on television, people still depended on radio. It was the only kind of news you could get for many years. One thing I'd like you to do when you're in the UK is listen to the Today program on Radio 4. Even today, it is the most important news program in the country. If the Prime Minister is going to go on one news program in the country, it will be the Today program on Radio 4. It has an importance well beyond any other radio news program globally. And for the foreseeable future, it's going to be the backbone of news. But that's really where radio news ends in its domain. Television news is in the driver's seat in most cases. Now, going back historically, BBC anchors were called presenters. They actually wore tuxedos in the old day of radio news, and they were hired guns who came in, announcers who would come in to read the news. It was much later that journalists actually came in to anchor the news. Newscasts are called bulletins, so you'll probably hear some of our speakers talk about the news bulletin. It's not an urgent report as it is in the U.S. A bulletin is just the regular newscast, like the 5 o'clock bulletin, the 3 o'clock bulletin. One thing you'll notice also is the pace of television news is a lot slower than in the U.S. It's quickened in the past few years, but in the 60s and 70s, it wasn't unusual at all to have long reports, sometimes 3 or 4 minutes from a foreign correspondent. And still today, they're much longer than in the U.S. And with the BBC, as you might expect, the emphasis was on being right rather than first, although we'll see that's changing a bit. As far as some characteristics of BBC television news, one thing you'll notice is the BBC has more text, more words, and fewer visuals than American television news. This has been the case for several years and still continues today, although there's certainly a lot of visuals in their regular bulletins. ITV became the dominant source of news later on, and it forced the BBC to become more visual, to become more modern in its approach to TV news. So towards the 70s, you began to see a change. News in the UK was always separated into news and current affairs, news being day-to-day coverage of events, current affairs documentaries, longer form of news, more like magazine programs. And today, those have started to meld together. That distinction has largely faded away, and the staffs have been united. Most recently, BBC has a 24-hour news channel now in response to some of its competitors. It's called News 24, and you'll be able to watch it around the clock while you're there. Just a rolling TV news channel, much like CNN in the U.S. The strength of the BBC definitely is in its correspondence. While U.S. networks may have fewer than a dozen foreign correspondents, there are 250 people around the world gathering news for the BBC in just about every country you can imagine, whether it's Mali or Chad, Burkina Faso in Africa, or Bangladesh or Bhutan in Asia. There's a BBC correspondent there. American correspondents have to parachute in usually for second-day coverage when there's a big event. And the BBC prides itself in the number of people it has on the ground. It makes a substantive difference in their coverage. And these people live there 365 days a year, so they understand what's happening far better than the episodic coverage that most news organizations give. Also, the correspondents aren't the glamour people that they often are on American networks. They're real journalists who have no real ambition beyond covering the news in their particular patch. There are also many stringers for the BBC. And because the BBC World Service is so strong in all of these countries, there's a crossover between the resources of the World Service and what serves the domestic BBC. By far, the BBC has the strongest correspondent corps of any news organization in the world. The picture here shows the new headquarters of BBC News, which is a modern attachment to Broadcasting House, the original home of the BBC, where Edward R. Murrow used to broadcast from the roof during the Blitz. But you can see it's state-of-the-art in every way, and it brought everything in BBC News together. They were in several different buildings. They had their own silos. For the first time, BBC News is united, and the strength of this organization, the unity, the synergy, is starting to shine. As we know, the BBC got competition in 1955 when ITV began, and we entered that period of the comfortable duopoly. For ITV and its news, it contracted with a separate company called Independent Television News, ITN. Now, we're not used in the U.S. to a company that produces news, but that's what ITN does. They also do it for Channel 4, and they do it for Channel 5. So ITN was very similar to the BBC. It followed many of its editorial values, but they were more visual. They had a lot of characteristics of U.S. television news, and it put pressure on the BBC to up its game and make itself more appealing. Once the resources of the ITV were pumped into news, it was pretty apparent that they had the upper hand over the BBC beginning in the 70s and 80s. And for a long period there, ITN News was very much dominant over BBC News. The flagship program of ITN News was News at 10. The gentleman at the right there is one of its longtime anchors, Trevor McDonald, regarded in his time as the most trusted man in Britain, the Walter Cronkite of Britain. Because they placed some attention on anchors, much like U.S. News did, these personalities started to emerge at ITN and led to more pressure at the BBC. ITN News was much smaller than the BBC. They didn't come close to 250 correspondents. They didn't have nearly the resources of the BBC, but they made up for it in hard work and gritty journalism and stayed even with the BBC step for step on most major news stories. This is the man I bring up because he has been so important to the British Media Studies course throughout the years. His name is Sir David Nicholas. He's getting up in age now and probably won't be able to speak to our class this year, but did so for 25 plus years. He created the News at 10. He was a former head of ITN News after that, a very staunch defender of journalism in the UK, and his professional offspring are planted away in every quality news operation in Britain. You mentioned the name Sir David Nicholas, and people have a special reverence for this special man. Eventually, ITN's star began to fade, and the BBC became resurgent again. And one of the ways that ITN developed a revenue source was aggressively marketing its archive. As it turned out, they had all the Pathé newsreels from the 30s and 40s that people used to see in movie theaters to get their news, and many resources that nobody else had, as well as the whole library of ITN news for many years. They started to sell that and make a profit from it. Now every news organization in the world leans heavily on its archive in selling footage for documentaries, for use in broadcast news programs, for company use. Anytime you want footage, you usually have to buy it from one of these archives. For a long time, there were just two competitors, BBC and ITN News. And then when B-Sky B came along, they had a 24-hour news channel, the first 24-hour news channel in the country. And it became a very respected source of information. The BBC, for many years, had nothing to compete with it. Sky News was owned by Rupert Murdoch and the News Corporation, so it actually was a sister channel of Fox News. But because of the impartiality guidelines, really not much in common at all. Sky News is a straight down the middle news source that prides itself on breaking news. It will probably look similar to CNN to you when we visit Sky News. Now, there have been critics through the years who think Sky News is too much into the breaking news and too quick to lead with things that have not been verified. So you may hear the moniker "not wrong for long" if someone is not a particular fan of Sky News. There was an important event in 2005, July 7th, 2005. It was their 9/11, when there were simultaneous explosions in the UK, in the tube, on buses that killed several people and threw the country into turmoil. It was a perfect story for a news organization. And Sky News dominated that story entirely. The BBC was caught flat-footed. Sky News got all the acclaim. They had the viewer audience and really established themselves as the place to go to with a breaking news story. And the BBC had to rethink their entire way of dealing with breaking news stories. And a year later, the BBC looked much more like Sky News in the way it approached its stories than it had the year before, being a lot more agile by trying to not wait until it had verified everything with two sources.